It happened in the middle of a meeting that had already stretched on for 3 long hours, inside a room deep within the Vatican where even the air seemed controlled and measured. There were cardinals seated around the table, but no press, no interpreters, and no staff beyond what was strictly necessary. Everything about the setting suggested precision, restraint, and secrecy. Pope Leo XIV had been listening the entire time, carefully following the arguments, watching how each man spoke and how each silence landed between them. When he finally responded, he did not rush. He allowed the silence in the room to build first, as if he wanted it to reach a certain weight before he spoke into it. Then he said one single sentence. It was not raised in anger. It was not framed as a decree, and it did not carry the tone of punishment or authority in the usual sense. It was delivered in the same steady, almost quiet voice he had used throughout the meeting, and that consistency made it harder to dismiss. For nearly half a minute, no one in the room moved. 14 senior cardinals sat frozen, men who had spent decades inside Vatican life learning how to control their expressions, how to hide shock behind discipline, how to remain composed even when challenged. But something in that moment broke through all of it. The stillness in the room was no longer professional restraint. It was tension that had nowhere to go. Then slowly one of them moved. He was 71 years old, a figure widely known inside the Curia for his loyalty to procedure and institutional continuity, a man who had served across 34 years under 4 different popes. He pushed his chair back with deliberate care, stood up without a word, and walked toward the exit. No explanation, no confrontation, no final remark. The door closed behind him with a soft click, yet in that silence it felt louder than anything that had been said in the room. Nobody stopped him. Nobody called his name. Pope Leo simply watched the door settle back into place, then turned his attention again to the remaining cardinals. His expression did not change, and that more than anything unsettled those who remained. He had not lost control of the meeting. He had redirected it entirely, forcing every person present to sit inside a question they had not prepared to answer. The discussion that day had officially been framed as a conversation about pastoral strategy, global conflict, and the limits of papal speech in an increasingly unstable world. It had not appeared suddenly. It had been requested after a carefully constructed letter, signed by 14 senior cardinals, was sent to the Secretariat of State only 3 days earlier. On the surface, that letter read like counsel offered in respect. Beneath its careful phrasing, it carried a warning. It suggested that Pope Leo XIV was speaking too directly about war, arms, and human suffering, and that his voice was pulling the Church closer to political confrontation than spiritual guidance. But Leo did not answer that concern with administrative language or diplomatic delay. He responded by calling them into a room, and eventually with a single sentence that would shift the atmosphere of the entire institution. Inside the Vatican, there are meetings the world never sees. Public ceremonies, audiences, and official statements present a carefully ordered image of unity and tradition. But beneath that surface, there is another level of decision-making where disagreements are sharper, consequences are heavier, and nothing is shaped for public comfort. It is in that hidden layer that the real tensions of the Church often surface, where senior figures debate not only doctrine or strategy, but the very meaning of authority itself. On April 10, 2026, one of those unseen rooms was filled with exactly that kind of tension. The atmosphere was already heavy before anyone spoke, because everyone present understood this was not a routine consultation. It was a confrontation dressed in institutional language. 14 senior cardinals had arrived because they believed the Pope had crossed a line in how openly he was addressing global conflict. They were not there to challenge his authority directly, but to press against the direction of his public voice, and to question whether it was placing the Holy See in a position of unnecessary exposure. What they thought would be a controlled discussion would soon become something far less predictable, as the conversation began to shift from concern over tone to a deeper question neither side could avoid, whether silence itself had become a moral failure. The confrontation did not begin in the room itself. It began 3 days earlier, with a letter that moved through the Vatican's internal channels with the kind of careful precision that only senior churchmen know how to use. It was delivered to the Secretariat of State and signed by 14 cardinals representing different regions of the world, across 3 continents, each name carrying institutional weight. The writing was formal, restrained, and carefully balanced in tone. It read like counsel offered out of respect, not resistance. But beneath that surface language, the intent was clear. The cardinals were raising concern about the direction of Pope Leo XIV's public voice, especially his repeated comments on war, arms, and global suffering. They were not accusing him of wrongdoing, but they were questioning whether his manner of speaking was drawing the Church too visibly into political conflict. The structure of the letter reflected long Vatican tradition. It avoided direct confrontation, avoided emotional language, and avoided anything that could be interpreted as rebellion against authority. Instead, it used carefully chosen phrases that carried institutional pressure without breaking respect. They referred to the idea of prophetic neutrality, a long-standing principle in church history, suggesting that the Holy See must remain able to speak across divisions without appearing aligned with any political side. In their framing, this was not about limiting moral concern, but about protecting the Church's universal role. If the Pope's words were being quoted in political debates, if governments were using them selectively, then the risk, they argued, was not only misunderstanding, but long-term damage to the Church's credibility as a spiritual authority. But even in its most careful wording, the deeper concern was unavoidable. The cardinals were warning that moral clarity, if expressed too directly in moments of conflict, could be interpreted as political alignment, and once that perception formed, it would be difficult to reverse. They argued that the Church's strength lay in its ability to remain present to all sides, even in moments of war, without being seen as belonging to one. The danger from their perspective was not the Pope's intentions, but the consequences of his visibility. A statement made in Rome could travel instantly, be extracted from context, and used far beyond its intended meaning. That, they believed, was where institutional risk began. Yet beneath that reasoning, a more difficult question slowly emerged, even if no one wrote it directly. If neutrality required silence in the face of suffering, then what exactly was being protected? The Church's mission, or its image of stability? That tension remained unspoken in the letter, but it shaped everything inside it. Pope Leo XIV did not delay his response. When the letter reached his desk, advisors within the Curia expected a controlled written reply. That would have been the traditional path, a carefully composed document acknowledging concern, reaffirming respect, and closing the matter without escalation. It would have preserved distance and avoided placing senior cardinals in direct opposition inside a shared space. Several voices within the Vatican quietly recommended that approach, warning that a face-to-face meeting could turn internal disagreement into visible division. But Leo chose differently. He reviewed the letter in silence, then set it aside. His decision was immediate and firm. If the cardinals believed their concerns were serious enough to put in writing, then they should be willing to repeat them in person. He did not see value in insulating disagreement through documents when the issue itself was about responsibility and truth. So he granted the meeting. That decision changed the nature of the letter entirely. It was no longer just a written exchange within institutional channels. It had become something heavier, something that would take shape inside a room, with voices, faces, and consequences that could not be edited afterward. In the days leading up to the meeting, Pope Leo XIV did not withdraw from public life. He continued his schedule without visible alteration. Morning prayers remained unchanged. Public audiences continued. He met with representatives of different humanitarian organizations, speaking in steady terms about the Church's responsibility toward the poor and displaced. He received diplomats, including the ambassador of a Central African nation, and spent extended time discussing conditions in border regions affected by ongoing conflict. To those observing him, there was no sign of retreat or hesitation. he also made decisions that reflected his internal clarity. One afternoon, he ended a long-standing Vatican investigation into a women's religious congregation that had been under review for 2 decades. His decision was not announced with ceremony. It was simply concluded. For him, it was an act of judgment based on what he believed to be unnecessary institutional pressure. These choices, taken together, showed a pontificate that was not reacting defensively to criticism, but continuing forward with its own internal logic. Still, he did not ignore the letter. In private, he read it carefully. He went through each paragraph, noting where the arguments carried institutional weight and where they reflected a more cautious vision of the Church's public role. He understood that the concern was not imaginary. There were real questions about how the Church speaks in moments of global conflict and how its words are received outside theological spaces. But he also saw something else, an attempt, conscious or not, to slow the direction of his papacy through procedural pressure rather than open disagreement. By the time April 10th arrived, both sides had already formed their positions. The meeting was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon inside a private Vatican room reserved for high-level internal consultations. It was not a public event and there were no media observers. The space itself was formal, structured around a long table designed for institutional dialogue rather than ceremony. 14 cardinals arrived first, each carrying the weight of decades inside the Church's administrative and theological structure. Members of the Secretariat of State were present as institutional witnesses, but they did not intervene. Their role was observation, not participation. When Pope Leo XIV entered, he did so exactly on time. He greeted each cardinal individually, briefly, without ceremony or hesitation. There was no visible tension in his manner. Those observing closely noted not distance but control. He was fully present, fully aware, and not reacting emotionally to the atmosphere in the room. The senior cardinal among them, 74 years old and widely respected for his political and theological judgment, opened the discussion. He spoke for more than 20 minutes. His argument was structured, historical, and carefully grounded in church tradition. He referenced earlier papacies, official documents, and long-standing theological principles that supported the idea of prophetic neutrality. He acknowledged the Pope's intentions as sincere, even necessary in moral terms, but argued that intention alone could not account for institutional consequences. The Church, he said, had to consider not only what it meant to say something, but what would happen after it was said. When he finished, the room did not immediately move. The silence that followed was not confusion, but containment. Each man in the room understood that the argument had been carefully constructed and that it was not casual advice. It was a warning framed in respect. Pope Leo XIV listened without interruption. He did not respond immediately, and that pause was not theatrical. It was reflective. Then, instead of countering the argument point by point, he shifted the entire direction of the conversation with a single question. Pope Leo XIV did not respond immediately to the senior cardinal's carefully built argument. He sat in silence for a moment, not as a performance, but as if weighing something that could not be reduced to the language already in the room. The tension did not break, it simply deepened, because everyone understood he was not preparing a standard reply. He was preparing a shift in direction. Then he spoke, and instead of addressing the points raised about tradition, risk, or institutional credibility, he asked a question that changed the entire atmosphere of the meeting. He said, "Tell me what you believe the Church is for." At first, the question seemed simple, almost too direct for a room shaped by formal language and theological precision. The senior cardinal began to respond, prepared to frame his answer within doctrine and established teaching. But before he could continue, Pope Leo raised his hand slightly, not in interruption of authority, but in control of direction. He clarified the question, and in doing so removed every safe layer the room had prepared to hide behind. "Not what the documents say," he added, his voice steady and unchanged. "Not what tradition describes in abstract terms. What do you believe personally, here now in this moment, with the world as it is outside these walls?" The room shifted immediately. This was no longer a debate about policy or communication strategy. It was no longer about how the Church should speak. It was about why the Church exists at all, stripped of institutional language. And that kind of question does not allow rehearsed answers. No one responded right away. 14 men who could easily speak for hours in theological precision now found themselves in a silence they could not easily fill. Each of them could have answered as scholars or administrators, but that was not what had been asked. The question required something more exposed, something less protected by structure. The silence stretched. 10 seconds passed, then 20. In that time, the room did not feel empty. It felt concentrated, as if every word not spoken was being examined before it could even exist. Pope Leo did not rush them. He remained still, letting the silence do its work, refusing to rescue the moment with explanation. Finally, he spoke again, but this time it was not a continuation of the question. It was a statement, and it landed with a clarity that cut through the institutional framing of everything that had been said before. The Church that stays silent when children die to protect its image has no image worth protecting. The sentence was not loud, and it was not delivered as condemnation, but it was absolute in tone, and its simplicity made it harder to deflect. It did not reference policy or tradition. It pointed directly at consequence, and in that moment every argument about neutrality, credibility, and institutional risk became secondary to something more immediate. The Cardinals did not react at first. No one interrupted. No one challenged the statement. The weight of it held the room in place, not because it was unexpected, but because it reframed everything they had just discussed. The conversation about political perception suddenly felt distant compared to what had just been said. Then slowly movement returned to the room. The 71-year-old cardinal, known for decades of disciplined service within the Vatican structure, pushed his chair back. It was not abrupt, and it was not dramatic. It was controlled, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its restraint. He stood without speaking, without looking at anyone for long, and walked toward the door. No one called after him. No one tried to stop him. The sound of his steps was steady, measured, and final. When he reached the door, he opened it and left. It closed behind him with a soft click that felt louder than anything that had been said inside the room. For a moment, no one moved. The remaining cardinals stayed seated, some looking at the table, others at their hands, none willing to break the silence that followed. Pope Leo XIV did not react outwardly. He simply watched the door, then returned his gaze to those still present. His expression had not changed. That consistency itself carried meaning, because it showed the moment had not been about emotion, but about conviction. When he finally spoke again, his tone remained calm, but the direction of the meeting had already shifted. He clarified that he was not asking them to agree with every public statement he had made. He was asking them to confront the framework behind their concern. The idea of prophetic neutrality, he said, was not being dismissed, but it needed to be examined honestly in the context of current suffering. He acknowledged its place in church history, but questioned whether it could still function as it was being used in the present. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Instead, he pushed the discussion toward a more difficult space, asking whether institutional caution had begun to overlap with moral hesitation. Several cardinals attempted to respond. Some returned to theological language, others to historical precedent. But something had changed. The conversation no longer moved in a straight line. It circled, paused, and recalibrated itself repeatedly. Even those who disagreed could feel that the structure of the argument had shifted. The senior cardinal did not withdraw his position. He remained composed, continuing to defend the need for institutional caution. But he no longer framed it with the same certainty as before. Instead, he asked a different kind of question near the end, one that was more practical than theoretical. He asked what the Vatican's actual strategy was in addressing the conflict zones being discussed. Not the public statements, but the concrete mechanisms behind them. Pope Leo responded without hesitation. He outlined the channels of communication, the humanitarian coordination, and the diplomatic efforts taking place behind official statements. He spoke in detail but carefully, without exposing sensitive operational information. The answer was not defensive, it was factual, and in that shift, something subtle changed again. The room did not transform into agreement, but it softened slightly. The distance between positions did not disappear, but it was no longer absolute. The Cardinals were no longer only speaking in principles. They were now confronted with processes already in motion. That difference mattered. When the meeting finally began to come to a close, the atmosphere was no longer as rigid as it had been at the beginning. The disagreement had not been resolved, but it had been forced into a more grounded space. As the Cardinals began to leave, the man who had walked out earlier was not in the room, but he was not far. He was standing in the corridor near a narrow window overlooking the Vatican gardens. The others passed him quietly, without comment. Pope Leo XIV stepped out afterward and saw him there. He paused briefly, then approached. He asked simply, "Are you all right?" The cardinal did not answer immediately. He looked toward the gardens, then back at the Pope. His composure remained intact, but it was no longer automatic. After a moment he said, "I need time to think." Leo nodded. He did not press him. He only replied, "Take the time you need, and when you are ready, come back." Then he continued walking, leaving the cardinal standing by the window, still facing the gardens as the weight of what had been said continued to settle in silence behind him. 3 days later, the cardinal returned. There was no announcement, no formal explanation, and no public acknowledgement of what had changed in him during that time. He simply came back to the Vatican, resumed his place within the institution, and re-entered the rhythm of his duties as if the interruption had been internal rather than external. What happened in those 3 days was never recorded in any official document, and no one inside the room where the meeting had taken place ever repeated their private conversations about it. But what mattered was not what was said in those days, but what no longer needed to be said afterward. No second letter followed. The organized pressure that had brought 14 senior cardinals into the same room did not escalate further. It did not collapse dramatically, and it did not turn into open conflict. Instead, it simply stopped advancing. In a place like the Vatican, where institutional processes rarely move backward, even stillness can signal change. Inside the wider structure of the Church, life continued in its usual rhythm. Public statements were issued, diplomatic meetings proceeded, and pastoral work across different regions of the world remained ongoing. But within certain internal circles, the effect of that meeting was quietly acknowledged, not as a victory for one side or another, but as a moment where the tone of an argument had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed. Pope Leo XIV did not treat the outcome as resolution. He did not issue a statement about it, nor did he present it as confirmation of a position. Instead, he returned to his regular responsibilities. That evening, he reviewed reports from humanitarian operations linked to conflict zones that had been discussed during the meeting. One document described the opening of a humanitarian corridor 2 days earlier. It confirmed that aid was reaching displaced families who had gone weeks without consistent access to food and medical support. The scale of the operation was limited compared to the size of the crisis, but the impact on individual lives was immediate and measurable. He read the report once, then again more slowly. He noted specific logistical concerns raised by field coordinators and made brief annotations, requesting adjustments to improve protection for aid delivery routes. The notes were concise, practical, and focused on implementation rather than theory. Once finished, he placed the documents aside for follow-up and turned off the lamp on his desk. Outside the Vatican, the broader world continued to move through instability. Diplomatic negotiations over the conflict remained fragile. Ceasefire discussions held in some regions while breaking down in others. In displacement camps, families continued to navigate uncertainty, waiting for supplies, information, and safety that often arrived inconsistently, if at all. Leo was fully aware that no single decision, no sentence, and no meeting could resolve the scale of suffering involved. He understood that the humanitarian corridor he had just read about was not enough to match the magnitude of the crisis it was trying to address. But he also understood something else that shaped his perspective more firmly than abstract debate. Inaction was not neutral. It carried consequences that fell most heavily on those who had no influence over political or institutional decisions. That understanding was not something he had formed recently. It came from earlier years spent far from Rome, in places where institutional language carried less weight than immediate human need. Those experiences remained part of how he interpreted responsibility, especially when decisions in the Vatican risked becoming disconnected from their real-world impact. The cardinal who had walked out of the meeting was not seen by Leo as an opponent in any personal sense. He was rather a product of a system shaped by long habits of caution, procedural discipline, and institutional preservation. Within that kind of formation, caution becomes stability, and stability can slowly begin to outweigh urgency. Leo recognized that pattern not as failure, but as a natural consequence of time spent inside any large institution that values continuity. That was why the sentence spoken in the meeting mattered more than the disagreement itself. It had not been rehearsed, and it had not been designed as a rhetorical device. It emerged at the point where institutional reasoning reached its limit and direct moral responsibility became unavoidable. The church that stays silent when children die to protect its image has no image worth protecting. Those words did not end the debate. They removed the ability to keep it contained. After that moment, the discussion could no longer remain abstract. It had to exist in relation to consequences that were no longer theoretical. A cardinal had left the room. He had returned days later. The institutional pressure that had initiated the confrontation did not continue in its original form. Nothing collapsed, but something adjusted. And in the Vatican, where change is often measured in restraint rather than disruption, that adjustment was significant. The Church did not change direction overnight. There was no visible rupture, no public acknowledgement of internal conflict, and no formal resolution announced to the world. But within its internal structure, something had shifted in a quieter way. The argument had moved from being something managed through documents and formal language to something that now existed in lived awareness. That evening, as Pope Leo XIV turned off the light in his study, the weight of the day did not appear on his face as triumph or relief. It remained as something more measured, closer to responsibility than conclusion. The work outside his window continued without pause, and the world he was speaking into remained unchanged in its complexity. If anything had changed, it was not the world itself, but the refusal to let its suffering remain distant from the language of those who spoke about it.